Good evening, everyone. Hello, welcome. Thank you very much for coming. The acoustics of this room are amazing, at least they appear to be. I'm not trying to speak up at all, but it sounds like everybody should be able to hear me. If ever anyone cannot hear either myself or our guest, please say so, and we can of course speak louder. None of us are used to being in this room. It's my first time in it, so I don't know how it really works. So my name is Bill Hurst. I'm the Deputy Director of the Centre for Geopolitics here at Cambridge. And today we're going to be discussing China and Russia, the relationship between China and Russia. And this is a relationship that's incredibly important, but actually too little studied and too often studied by people who don't really know both sides. So today we're really fortunate to have a guest who actually does know both countries really well. It's incredibly rare that you find somebody that actually knows both these countries very well. Dr. Berzina-Cerenkova is Professor of Political Science, Director of the PhD program, and Head of the China Studies Center at Riga Stratons University in Riga, Latvia. She's written a new book called Perfect Imbalance. I want to say imperfect balance, but it's Perfect Imbalance, China and Russia, that I believe is just out a couple months ago, right? And so please welcome Una Berzina-Cerenkova.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And I want to say that we have lured you here today with an impossible promise. We promised that during this following 1.5 hours, we will deliver on the past, the present, and the future of the China-Russia relationship. So let's see how much we can actually deliver. So it's been more than 330 years of the Treaty of Nerchinsk and 70 years of the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. But today, actually, is when the Chinese-Russian partnership has grown to be extremely multifaceted. So when both leaders say it's the strongest that's it's ever been in history, it's hard to disagree. And of course, why should we worry? Why should we be interested in it? Is because it kind of signals a new phase in this post-Cold War era, because it holds political, economic, security, as we will definitely discuss today, environmental and technological implications globally, not just for Eurasia, but globally. But anything beyond this conclusion is being debated. For example, are they moving towards an alliance? Is there going to be a Russia-China military alliance with a mutual defense clause soon? Debatable. I have an opinion, of course, but it is debatable in the field. Are they? Is Russia a junior partner and knows it and acts in a way that presents it as a junior partner or not? Or is it unaware? Did Xi Jinping know about the invasion plans during Putin's visit during the Olympics? And all these questions, they pile up, and you know even more of them, but without knowing for sure, how do we even name such a relationship? And my suggestion to you is this perfect imbalance concept, because I believe it suits well a description of what this partnership of Russia and China is like. Perfect imbalance is a concept that comes from the game development industry, or so the internet tells me, but actually professionals have confirmed. And the idea behind it is that partners don't have to be symmetrical to be able to work together for certain goals. The concept comes basically from the multiplayer online games, where there's an old player that's been playing for a long time, is very strong, has gathered a lot of, weapons, strength, experience. But if these players are unbeatable, then new players don't want to join, so there's no business for the company. So what the company does is it creates such conditions that the weaker players always have some way to beat the best. And the weaker player, and of course, alternatively, the stronger player has to sleep with one eye open and is aware that they're not unbeatable. And I think that helps us to break out from several unhelpful concepts and unhelpful frames that we oftentimes hear when we talk about the Russia-China relationship. The first frame that it helps us to break out of is this idea of junior senior partner, and basically the asymmetry of the Russia-China relationship, because as per perfect imbalance, you don't have to be symmetrical. In fact, there are very few relationships in today's world between bilateral relationships where countries are symmetrical. So it's interesting that this concept is being so actively applied to this particular relationship. When I think about symmetrical relationships, the only thing that comes to mind is us and our neighbors, Lithuania, for example. Like both small countries, very symmetrical relations. But so as long as each side has some leverage, even if it's imbalanced, there is a level of interdependence. And of course, when it comes to the Russia-China relations, it's the border that is leverage for both sides, and among other things. Now, the second thing about this concept of perfect imbalance is that it is, of course, unstable. And that helps us to break out of another not always helpful concept that we have in our minds about the Russia-China relationship, that the question is, how stable is this relationship, right? Is it, so, and as if it's not stable, then it's not real. I argue with that. I think that stability has very little to do with it. It works in some ways today, and that's where this perfect imbalance kicks in. But what it also means is that something that we see actually unfolding, and we saw before the Russia's war in Ukraine, is that the side that feels disadvantaged uses various means, is being sneaky and is being creative, and also trying to include other parties in the equation, like Russia uses India, for example, for that goal, to up their chances of balancing out this relationship. But there's always anxiety long term. So I don't think, again, that this lens of stability of the relationship is something that helps us a whole lot in this quest. But I also like the third thing about perfect imbalance. It is a strategy. It is not a natural order of things. It's not how things have fallen into place or something that has come to be. It is, in fact, designed. It is a designed state of affairs. Sometimes it's designed from outside, as it is in the games, and sometimes it's designed from within, as it is in the Russia-China relationship, where both the political minds of both countries are trying to design this relationship in such a way. So I don't really, and what does that help us to break away from? It helps us to break away from the perception that this relationship is an anarchic result of some forces beyond human control, and that is just something so specific. It has to do with the Russian soul or with the Chinese civilization or something like that. And that's the third reason. You know, good things come in threes, so that's my three reasons I'm throwing out there to stake this concept. Now, let me talk about the method a little bit, because, well, this is a university audience, so you'll probably be grilling me about how did I even come to the conclusions that I've come to. I'm a discourse analyst by training. My dissertation was in critical discourse analysis, but since then I've actually, and that was on Chinese political discourse and how tradition was represented in the Hu Jintao decade, how it was used in policy, in his speeches. But like I said, I've moved away from the normative active position since then, more into kind of a discourse analysis as a tool. So basically, what that means is that I'm one of those people who use language to explain social phenomena, not the language itself, right? So this is not linguistics. Just we look at how meanings are created within the text, intertextually, so how texts work together, and also, of course, how does it measure up against the extra-textual reality? Because that's the number one bullet that is always being shot towards a discourse analyst. Well, yeah, but they're just words, right? Maybe they're just narratives, they're just stories. How do they even stand when it comes to reality? And so, of course, that third part is extremely important. And actually, in the case, just running ahead of the train here, and I got to tell you that in the case of the Russia-China relationship, actually, and the narratives the stories they tell about their cooperation, it doesn't measure very well with reality. It's very exaggerated, in fact. And to do this third thing, of course, it means that you have to do interviews. You have to do like all the normal stuff people do when they do research. You have to do interviews. You have to do with document analysis, and this is a question-driven rather than methodology-driven approach. And to quote the Latvian ambassador to China, who told me at one point, I was trying to tell him about discourse analysis and what a great method it is, and he told me, why don't you read all you can find in all the languages you know and tell me what the hell is going on? So yes, I live by that. And so this is where I will touch upon now the past and the present bits. And then to the future bit, I will also leave a little bit of time, but I'm not very good at a casino table. I'm not very good with the oracle bones either. So I think that the future bit is something we will discuss and we will bounce off each other. What I wanted when I got into this book and to write this book was to see, to answer one particular question. How close is Russia under Vladimir Putin and China under Xi Jinping really getting? And in order to, but that's like a big question, obviously. So I had to come up with a plan how to, but of course, which is not an exclusive way how to tackle this, but just my own way to tackle this. And what I thought to do first is I looked into what Putin and Xi, and of course their respective foreign policy establishments, right, say about this relationship in general. And quickly, three very distinct stories emerged, which were being repeated over and over again throughout the years, throughout pressers, throughout joint statements. So the first story was that about the close friendship between the leaders themselves. Personal friendship, a personal guarantee of the Russia-China relationship as exhibited by Putin and Xi making pancakes together, taking a cruise down the Neva River, watching ice hockey, doing all these things that you do with your friends, right? Normally. And of course, that kind of, in authoritarian countries, that makes sense because that's also how you try to, to demonstrate to the country, to the populations that this is indeed a friendship that's close, right? Now, the second story that immediately emerged was the story about high value added and innovative cooperation from China to Russia. So whenever cooperation is being touched in those documents, and I'm of course talking not just about Putin and Xi, I'm also talking about the ministers of foreign affairs, about the prime ministers' meetings, that there is a story that China wants to cooperate with Russia in high tech. It wants, and Russia wants the same, and it's going to happen. I think no establishment uses the future tense just quite as much as the Russian one, right? It's like, we will produce proof of something. Same thing here. So we will cooperate in higher technologies, in high tech, in med tech, in space, you name it. And why? Why then? Why this story when we know that, again, this doesn't match the reality? The reality is that it's a relationship, economic relationship, very heavily based on natural resource extraction and not downstream either. This is a very upstream cooperation with very little value added for the Russians. But why, right? Because there is this perception in Russia of being technologically superior, savvy, knowledgeable, and the rest of the world not knowing about it. There's of course the adoration of the space race times. There's the perception, and actually it's not a legend completely, because in fact almost 10% of Russians are one way or another registered as inventors. So that's a lot. And in my book, actually, I wrote down there was an interview with one of these people, and they tell him, well, what did you invent now? And he's got this incredible ingenuity-filled thing. And he says, well, if you don't have anything, you sit down and you figure it out and you make it. That's why we're inventors. But so this speaks to the Russian ambition and perception, the self-image, that we are indeed good at technology. And again, like I said, just like the first narrative, it's not really very based in reality. Now, the third narrative was extremely interesting because it was an attempt to reconcile the visions of Eurasian connectivity of the Chinese side and the Russian side. So we, of course, know about Xi Jinping's Belt and Road. We've also have heard a little bit about Putin's Eurasian Economic Union. But the imagery and the story that is being told from between the establishments towards the populations on the other side of the border is that it's basically both leaders endorse each other's visions. It's and for domestic Chinese populations, the story is that Putin basically believes in Belt and Road, but he just needs something, to fall back on in terms of something. If he wants to call it that, let him call it that. In Russia, it's the other way around. There was an article that came out that was called Belt and Putin. So in Russia, yeah, so the story for the Russian population domestically, so for the Chinese population, yes, we endorse Belt and Road, that's great. We are actually, through Eurasian Economic Union, not members, but we kind of support. For the Russian population, it is, let them have their Belt and Road, think about it, but they cannot really go around us. It's our vision. We've been here. We have all these connections in Central Asia, in Eastern Europe, so everything goes through us. And it's, Again, we see that this narrative as well is not grounded in reality, but it's so strong and it's out there and it is being repeated all over and over again. And when I found that, I wanted obviously to probe to see how are they then, if the stories, if these overarching strategic narratives that they tell about each other and to each other are so not grounded in reality, how are things looking then on the level of more tangible cooperation aspects? So how are they still talking about other smaller cooperation directions? And of course, to cross-check Putin's and Xi's stories where possible with what was really happening. And that's where my case studies kicked in. So I looked into security cooperation. And to just quickly go back to one of the initial questions I started, and whether there's going to be a Russia-China security alliance, I don't think so. It doesn't look like that. And you know why? Because they're signaling, at least the Russian side was signaling that there will be. But we know that narratives aren't really grounded in reality. Now I forget whether that was Peskov or Lavrov. I think that was Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who said, we're practically, when they asked them, so is there going to be an alliance? We're practically allies. What do you mean, is there going to be an alliance? So there's always this playing with concepts. But at the same time, when I was writing this chapter and through a lot of, that was very painful and tough, but at the end of the day, there's just so much mistrust. There are scientists being put behind bars in Russia for revealing some sort of information to the Chinese. There's an Arctic scientist, for example, what he could have revealed. Of course, we know that the Arctic is heavily securitizing and is very important for the Russian military. And yet, so there's a museum in China where the Russian passport holders just don't get in because it tells the story of Russia being the country that was one of the countries that basically tore China apart during the century of after the Opium War. So that was my conclusion. But of course, like I said, anything can be debated and contested. So I looked at security. I looked at the Arctic. I looked at how Russia and China act in each other as well, quote unquote neighborhoods, respectively. Of course, we know that there is no such thing as the Russian neighborhood or the Chinese neighborhood, but still, I looked at how China is trying to bypass Russia in Central Asia, is coming up with creative formats to get a seat at the table with, first of all, with an expanded concept of Central Asia, and secondly, it was trying to get a seat at the table when it's security talk without Russia being present. And I also looked at how Russians, in their turn, were trying to get involved closer with the Vietnamese in the oil exploration and the drilling to balance out. That was something that Vietnam wanted, to balance out China, and they failed. So I looked at Central Asia and Vietnam. And of course, I had to bring in India as one of the chapters because the chapter is called There's More to Eurasia Than Russia and China. It is an ignorable presence, not just because it is a huge country, and an important country, but because it is so present in the Russia-China bilateral relations that it just cannot be ignored. So I took a look at that. And I also took a look at space. What is the degree of the Chinese-Russian complementarity in space? How much of it is just stories? Because I guess if you ask any child on the street, they're going to tell you that China and Russia is cooperating in space. It's of course the story is much more complicated than that, but still you cannot deny some level of complementarity in space technology between Russia and China. Actually, this was one of the last chapters, and I went in thinking that it's going to be same old, just talk, not a lot of common interest. And why would the Chinese need the Russians anyway? You know, with their technology is. I actually say this a lot, but I love this example. China refers to Russia as a veteran power. I think that is a beautiful way. It's respectful on one hand, but on the other hand, that is a very nice way to say, your best days are behind you. Step aside now, it's time for some. So this veteran power still, as it appears, has a thing or two to teach to China. And what I found particularly interesting, especially during my interviews for the space bit, was the idea about the human flight, human space flight. My Chinese counterparts told me that, yes, we would eventually solve these problems, but Russians have been doing this and they've paid for this, not just with money, but with blood, sweat, and tears for decades. And they've solved some of the issues that would require, basically, put it bluntly, deaths in space to sort out. And why shouldn't we take over this experience rather than go this way? Of course, technologically, we can do a lot of things ourselves, but why don't we take a look at these things that they've solved already? So that was just one example when I was proven wrong, going into the chapter with a wrong preconception, and I was checked. The last chapter is actually the most problematic one. Spirit of the times, requirement of the editors, and peer pressure got me to write about COVID. And I actually wanted it as well because it looked like something that was the ideal stress test of the relationship, right? Because when COVID emerged, it turned the relationships between many countries sour. Suddenly, everybody started closing up borders and not letting neighbors in, and that kind of thing. So it looked like a good stress test. And what I did is I tried to see what were the similarities and differences, how the partners dealt with the first wave of COVID-19. How they renegotiated their global roles through that, and that's where there was a lot of support. So China was backing Russia, Russia was backing China. But when it came, and they talked about the Health Silk Road and how a lot of cooperation in health, in global health will come out of this, and how these countries will usher it in, and how China will be this new herald of this frontier. But when you take a look at what happened on the ground, there was a lot of mistrust, but there was also a learning curve. Administratively, both leaders, they tried to leverage responsibility at first, to push responsibility away from the center towards the regions, and then quickly, immediately took it back blaming the regional officials on all the failures, and basically which resulted in more federalization in Russia, and one can argue that also in China. But what I did fail to do in that chapter is, of course, I couldn't tell the whole story because it was just the first wave, and I think it's the most dated chapter when we read the book today. So if, I've been talking for a long time, sorry. So just to go back, that then if it's not, if there is no alliance in sight, then what? What is happening? Does that mean that they're going to drift apart eventually? I would say that this relationship will continue to grow and it will continue to expand as per this perfect imbalance concept because of both domestic and external reasons. Domestically, there are a lot of similarities between the governance outlooks of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. This sovereignty, that worshipping at the altar of sovereignty is one of them, of course, but there are so many other, information control, administrative strategies, domestic ideologies, that kind of thing. Secondly, even though there is on both sides of the border, there's a lot of unhappiness with the other in terms of societies. So we know what these historic grievances are, but the information spaces of China and Russia are so sealed off that these grievances don't make it over because they're being controlled. So that is not a problem. The fact that the Russians that the Chinese consider and remember that a big chunk of the Russian land used to be Qing Dynasty China is not a problem in Russia because you just don't let that information in, and the other way around. And when it comes, so there's a bunch of other domestic parallels, but now to the international arena, of course, there's the U.S. factor. And the U.S., and I think now again with Russia's war in Ukraine, we see how important the U.S. factor is in China's foreign policy. And as an argument, right, we're backing Russia discursively because of the U.S. and NATO. There is also but there's also another reason, which is not a negative reason, which is actually a positive reason. China and Russia both understand that mutual cooperation is central to Eurasian stability. At least when I got some I have to say that I got more of the Russian interviews in than the Chinese interviews for various reasons. But when I was talking to some people who were in the who had been in the Russian political establishment, they really that was, with all the cynicism that was there was still this message that we got to cooperate. And I think that also somehow, but also with China and India. That's how the psalm always goes. And that is the heritage of the Primakov doctrine, of what in the late 90s, the then Prime Minister of Russia came up with this idea that, we're going to be like Moscow, New Delhi, and Beijing. That's going to be the guarantor of the Eurasian stability. Obviously, the other two countries weren't super excited at the time, but that's kind of how RIC and BRICS grew out of it. And even though we know that BRIC and RICS are in cold storage now because of China-India tensions, but at the end of the day, still, that's the logic that is still alive in the Russian foreign policy establishment. So it's going to grow. Regardless of the challenges that, of course, remain. And now let me go back to, so that was past, present, and now to the future, just one sentence. I'm being tagged on Twitter all the time when I write something and people tag China is with Russia. So there's a hashtag now, China is with Russia, and it's also used to disagree with some of my points. And even on this event tweet, actually somebody had put in the Economist article with, was it Putin sitting in Xi Jinping's lap or something? So there is this perception, of course, for this minor partner logic, and it's, of course, grounded in reality. And of course, geopolitically, from the Baltic and Polish interest and perspective. I agree, they are too close now with the war in Ukraine. China is signaling a lot of support, not necessarily granting it, as we know, right? But signaling it. And that is bad news for the country. So, for example, my Polish colleagues have expressed that this demonstrates that this is not a very trustworthy strategic partner, at the end of the day, if you stand with the other party. But I think that the bilateral dynamic between these two countries, the distrust and the dysfunctionality of the relationship is so hard to overcome that I just don't believe in the hashtag China is with Russia yet. Maybe you will change my mind today. And that's the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting to think of some of the images coming out of this. I mean, the image of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin cooking pancakes together, immediately brought to my mind the image of Mao and Khrushchev debating nuclear war while floating around the swimming pool at 3 a.m. It's kind of, these interesting interpersonal relationships that have animated that relationship. But I guess for the first sort of serious question that I'll put to you is, we're talking, at least in theory, about sort of past, present, and future. And the book and your talk is very much about the present. But then the question is sort of, when does the present start? Because if we go all the way back, to Second World War, 1949, clearly there's a very close relationship of cooperation, despite what happened at the Junyi Conference, despite the various other splits between Mao and Stalin about how to handle the Civil War and occupation of the Northeast by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. All of this to one side, there's a very close relationship through much of the 1950s. Then we see a clear split in the early 1960s, and then at some point, some moving back closer together after about 1989, right? And more slowly after the demise of the Soviet Union. But then, when does that next period start? Because I remember, I think it was 2005, the famous Year of Russia in China that was all over everything in the propaganda. And supposedly, according to the Chinese media, there was a Year of China in Russia the next year. Well, I don't know if anybody in Russia heard that at all. One of these potential disconnects. But is that the start of the current era? Is the rise to power of Xi Jinping the start, or Putin's return to power after being sort of exiled to the prime ministership? For that period around 2008-9, right? When do we see the current period emerging?
Well, I drew a line at Xi Jinping, but of course, when Xi Jinping came to power, Putin had been in power for 13 years already, at 12. Yeah. But of course, it is a trick question, and it's hard to draw such a line. And all of these dates that you mentioned are very, very valid. I'd love to start with the year of China and Russia and vice versa. I do have to say that I have to go with my gut here, and I have to say that when I lived in Beijing in 2004, 2005, Russia was a very distant topic. I was interviewing actually some of the Sino-Russian community members. For example, the daughter of Lily Said, who is a Russian speaker, and who her whole family is connected to both. And the idea that this relationship was marginal, I actually interviewed a couple of simultaneous interpreters. Is that how you call that, right? And these people said that they actually worked twice a year at that point. They worked twice a year for the Russian-Chinese conferences. So my feeling is that from 2005 and upwards, maybe perhaps after Russia's invasion in Georgia, perhaps after 2008, when because it's not just about these two countries, right? It's always about the international constellations and about what pushed them closer together. And as Russia became more and more isolated, and this is where I want to throw 2014 in the room, because after Crimea, Russia became extremely isolated, and that coincides with the beginning of Xi Jinping's rule. So I think definitely it was a stage-by-stage process. But the latest cut that we can make would be 2014.
Right, and then I guess the next thing to think about for me would be this idea of the perfect imbalance, right? Where both players are getting something from the interaction, even though they're highly asymmetrical. The implication is that China's the much stronger player, at least from what I took of the way you set it up. But in that case, what is China seeing in Russia beyond just natural resources and some defense technology and space things like this? Is Russia really an important sort of pole of the multipolar world that China wants to engineer? Or is Russia really just useful for these very targeted things in a way that would maybe minimize the relationship?
Certainly. Actually, I find it hard to measure the imbalance and this China as being a stronger partner. Of course, we can talk about economy, right? We can talk about the numbers. We can talk about that kind of thing. But it's really hard to say how many times is one strong. And I think one way to ask this question is to ask whether whether Xi Jinping has any sway over Putin. And Xi Jinping, as well as Li Keqiang during the Europe-China summit on April 1st, has signaled that no, like, we're trying to do this in our own way, but we don't really call the shots. Kind of Putin does what he wants, right? And that's hard. I haven't been a fly on that wall. I don't know how much of a sway, but it would make sense that, given that Putin's Russia has pivoted towards itself, it would make sense that it doesn't really take cues from China, at least the way we sometimes imagine when we talk about junior-senior partnership. Now, what is China seeing in Russia? Definitely, one part of it is the enemy of my enemy logic. The second part of it is, of course, the proximity and the fact that they have to negotiate, they have to live in Eurasia together. And still, I mean, Russia is, of course, a nuclear power. It has I was going to say strong military, but as the last couple of months have shown, maybe not so much, thankfully. But still, like this, it's not exactly a dwarf. So you have to have a way to build this relationship. And of course, then there is some of the joint perceptions, like I said, the sovereignty angle, the information control angle. Also, ideologically, I know I'm entering like into uncharted waters when I bring up ideology. It's very hard to talk about ideology in Russia today and in China today too. But still, there are some, for example, the way these countries approach religion or some sort of tradition, right? Religion not as a divinative practice, but as a tradition that puts you apart from the others in trying to create some more domestic solidarity, for example, that kind of thing. So a lot of approaches are similar. In that, of course, Russia is also an ally.
Right. I mean, one other sort of history-inflected question is, aren't we in some ways back to the 1950s, but in reverse? Are we sort of returning to, the Soviet-Chinese relationship circa 1956, 57, but with the relative imbalance on the other foot, as it were?
The imagery would certainly suggest that. Now, we've all seen the pictures of Mao Zedong and Stalin standing together, being the same height, or sitting in the chairs talking, that kind of thing. Yes, and there's some of that now with the imagery surrounding the current leaders. But of course, back then, it's hard for me to speak because I'm not a trained historian. I'm a historian because I just an amateur historian, right? But of course the situation is very different in how much ideology had to do with it then. But of course there are also parallels with the U.S. being this joint. So I don't know. It's actually it's very hard for me to say. I think that would be something that would need to be compared. And what do you think? I mean, you've been writing about these things. What's your take?
Wow. I mean, I haven't thought about it from that angle, but it does look more and more like that in a lot of ways, which then actually kind of feeds into the next thing I was going to ask you, which is about I know it's impossible to really be predictive, right? If we could predict things, we'd have a lot more influence in the world than we do. I mean, social scientists are terrible at predicting anything. And so I wouldn't put you on the spot and say, where is this going to go, predict the future of this relationship. But if we think a little bit sort of speculatively about it, if we are back to a kind of late 1950s scenario, right? And so, we could draw even parallels between the invasion of Ukraine and the invasion of Hungary, for example, and the way that China responded. And China was then thinking about the Soviet Union as increasingly not such a friendly country, and more problematic as the relationship grew. But if we think of it in another way, that you've kind of speculated, or not speculated, but postulated that the relationship is bound together by a kind of stable instability, right? That it's the very instability or uncertain nature of where things are going to go and how other players are going to react and so on that keeps them locked together, right? And from completely drifting apart. But what would mean that what would trigger a change in this relationship? So like, could we see another split like we saw in the early 1960s? Could we see, I mean, you've already sort of given away the hand of you don't see an alliance emerging. I don't either. I agree with you 100%. China only has one ally, North Korea, which is not a very convenient one to have, right? So, I don't think they want to pick up Russia, especially right now. It's like collecting inconvenient allies is not what they really want to do. But, I think what would trigger a closer relationship that's of a different kind? What would trigger a real split, right? Because this stable instability is not so firm for the longer period.
Yes, just a quick side note on North Korea. Actually, how the stories don't match the reality. China's foreign minister Wang Yi, when he would speak to Lavrov, he would always signal that China does not enter into alliances and does not, and there are the three no's, and one of them does not enter into the alliances. But there is an alliance on paper with North Korea that was recently, a couple of years ago, right, was prolonged. So again, that's so interesting to me that it's being spoken out at these Russia-China meetings as though. But now back to your original question, what would trigger a split? Well, if we are following the parallel of 1950s, then death. A certain death would trigger a split, because it was, of course, Stalin's death and Khrushchev's iconoclasty and in the Chinese revisionism, exactly, that in the Chinese eyes triggered
or Mao's
this.
dangerous radicalism. From
Yes, the radicalism. But while Stalin, my point is, while Stalin was alive, they were but that brings us back to the question of how true is the buddy narrative? Is it really something? Do they really get along that well? And I think the visit, the visit to Putin's visit to the Olympic visit to Beijing, kind of sends again mixed signals, because on one hand we could read it saying that this signals unity, that he in fact went to discuss some of the plans, and he said, okay, just don't do it during the Olympics like you did last time. but on what seems more plausible is that, of course, Putin did not disclose the whole scope of this operation, even though, of course, we know the secret services had been informed since many months before, but still he wasn't. So it didn't put Xi Jinping in a very good position. So it's really hard to say whether this buddy, this bromance is sometimes. I think it's a little bit maybe not very tasteful how sometimes they refer to the Western press as bromance, but still it's out there. How much of truth is to that? It's hard to say. So that would be the factor that would show us one way or another. But of course, another more geopolitical thing that could trigger a split would be Russia somehow acting against China's core interests. And that China's been very clear on that, right? So this is where we draw a line. Russia has not been doing that. And it's hard to imagine a scenario where Russia, I don't know what recognizes Taiwan or something. That doesn't, we don't, it's hard to imagine. But at the same time, Russians have a very cozy relationship with they've found a way, Putin has found a way to negotiate with ethnicities that were labeled Islamic extremists in the 90s. And now that is a question whether that is something that China can learn or that is something that China is afraid of. So that's another core interest. So that would be more. Now, of course, what we've all seen in the news is this idea that China could swim over Heilongjiang, swim over the Amur River, and start taking territories off of Russia, and that could trigger a split. I don't see that happening. I think that's sensationalist. But then again, my Indian colleagues tell me, yeah, it's not true until it's true. Now, and that's just as much as I thought, just to think about a little bit. What would trigger closer relations? More zero appeasement signals from the U.S. And a failure to somehow find some sort of common ground with China now against the backdrop of the Ukraine war. Maybe that is something. But then again, now we talk about closer relations emerging now against the backdrop of the Ukraine war, but what we actually see is a lot of opportunistic behavior on the Chinese side. And again, Russia signals out towards the outside audiences that everything's fine. We got a partner in the East. We have partnership without limits. So don't you worry. We don't need your markets. We don't need your McDonald's. We're very good right here. But when you talk to people, actually even when you rush the Russian propaganda channels, something that I like to do with my beer from time to time, you're going to see that there's a panic. The Chinese are coming. They're going to buy off everything cheaply. They're going to use this. We're being pressured by the sanctions now, and they're going to take advantage of us. Now, that doesn't sound very solid. That doesn't sound like solidarity at all. So I don't think that what we think now could trigger closer relations actually could. It could more make Russia put it in a more submissive position than it is now.
Very last small question, and it's a big theoretical one, and then we'll open it up for comments and questions from everybody else.
Bring it on,
It's
Bill.
very small, and it probably is spurious. But the question relates to this idea of strategic triangles or strategic polygons of whatever configuration you really like. You know, if you go all the way back to like the late 60s, early 70s, right? If we think about the relationship between the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, right? The great insight supposedly shared by both Nixon and Mao was that in this three-way relationship, if one side could manage to have positive relations with the other two while they hated each other, it would get you a whole lot of leverage, right? And the U.S. ended up winning that race to get in that position at the kind of fulcrum of the strategic triangle, while Soviet Union and China were still enemies. Now, if we think about Russia, India, and China, or Russia, India, Vietnam, and China, right? Some of these other countries that you brought up that are important players in Asia, those countries have very negative relationships with China over a very long span of time. India and Vietnam especially, right? Extremely negative relations. They have very strongly positive relations with Russia over a very long period of time, right? So to the extent that there is this Moscow, Delhi, Beijing nexus or constellation, it sounds to me more like the China, USSR, US triangle of the 70s, except in this case, Russia's at the fulcrum. If they've got a good relationship with China and a good relationship with India. Is there anything to that? Is it useful to think about sort of tectonic strategy of Asia in those sorts of terms, or?
Well, there is a triangle, but Russia doesn't have enough leverage to keep this fulcrum, because India is becoming more and more weary of this relationship and saying, when push comes to shove, who are you going to support? So there's not a lot when it comes to backing it. But I think that when it comes to the USSR, China triangle, domestic Chinese agency had a lot to do with it. And so the domestic policy matters. And if we draw a parallel to Russia today, then we see that there is very little nimble cooperation oriented, pragmatic thinking in the Russian establishment. Something that had taken place during Mao's last years and when he was already incapacitated and after he died, right? After the short power struggle when Deng Xiaoping came to power again. So that particular piece of the puzzle, which in my opinion was crucial for that triangle and for the U.S.-China rapprochement, is missing today from the Russian foreign policy. They cannot walk the talk at this point.
So it's as if Lin Biao is still in power.
Yes,
in that sense,
yes.
like pre-October 1971,
Yes.
right? Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you all very much once again for coming out and for a good discussion. And thank you so much.
Good.